Namaskar. Well, friends, I heartily welcome you to Bhim Bhashya, my audio video podcast series on Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar. This audio video podcast series has 54 short speeches on Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar, unraveling as many as 25 different dimensions of his multifaceted genius. Friends, this podcast series is focused on Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar, his thoughts, his actions, his philosophy, and above all, the grand vision that he had shown for our country. This is what this podcast series is all about. So let's move on. In this episode 23rd, let's turn to yet another dimension of Dr. Ambedkar's multifaceted genius. This is Dr. Ambedkar's role as a labor leader. Dr. Ambedkar's involvement in the Indian labor movement appears to have passed through several interesting phases. In the 1920s, when the labor movement in India was dominated by the communist-led trade unions, several calls were given for strikes by textile workers 1924, 1925, 1928, and 1929. In April 29, the strike covered as many as 75,000 workers from 43 textile mills. Yet another major strike was called in April 1934. Dr. Ambedkar firmly believed in workers' right to strike, but that weapon, he had argued, should be used judiciously and always in the interest of workers, not for political gains. Dr. Ambedkar vehemently opposed the communist-inspired strikes of the 1920s and the 1930s because of the underlying political motivations of the trade unions. Indeed, Dr. Ambedkar initiated extensive counteroffensive through his weekly Bahishkrut Bharat. He launched an extensive counter-campaign against the Girni Kamgar Union in 1929. Dr. Ambedkar argued that he was not in favor of the strike of 1929 simply because the condition of the depressed class workers had already been worsened by the earlier strikes. Not surprisingly, therefore, Dr. Ambedkar came to be branded by the communists as an enemy of the labor. In the chronology of events, Dr. Ambedkar's involvement in labor movement began formally in 1934 when he became the president of Mumbai Municipal Karmachari Sangh. The big moment, however, came with the establishment of his first political party, the Independent Labour Party. The manifesto of the Independent Labour Party was a document so unique that it has a distinctive place of its own. Among other things, particularly in respect of the industrial worker, the manifesto favored legislation to control employment, dismissal, promotion of employees. It also advocated legislation to limit the maximum amount of work that would be done per day by industrial workers. It also provided for remunerative wages, leave with pay, and to provide for inexpensive and sanitary housing. Understandably, the Independent Labour Party was not welcomed by the communists, who viewed it as an unnecessary division of the laborers. In class struggle, they argued, the interest of Dalits and non-Dalits were one and the same, and therefore there was no need for an independent labor party. The labor movement could be organized under the same banner. This was the argument made by the communist leaders. Actually, the rationale behind the Independent Labour Party was explained by Dr. Ambedkar in a conference of untouchable railway workers convened in Manmad in district Nashik on February 12 and 13. The year was 1938. Dr. Ambedkar argued very forcefully that communist leaders were fighting for the rights of the workers. But what about the human rights of Dalit workers within the workforce? No trade union, no union leader was fighting for the human rights of Dalit workers. For example, the textile mill unions had never raised their voice against the prohibitive barriers that kept Dalit workers away from the lucrative departments in the mills on account of their untouchability. In fact, this conference that I talked about, the Manmad Conference of February 1938, is a very important one. Dr. Ambedkar made a very comprehensive speech in that conference where he explained the philosophical basis of his strategy. He fully spelled out the strategy in his presidential address to this conference held in Manmad on February 13, 1938. I would like to quote some of the apart from this very, very important presidential address. Dr. Ambedkar said, and I quote him, "Labor leaders who are accusing me are undoubtedly suffering from certain delusions. They have read Karl Marx that there can be only two classes, owners and workers. And on reading Marx, they straightaway assume that in India, there are only owners and the workers. And then they proceed on their mission of demolishing capitalism. This would be positively erroneous with regard to India," said Dr. Ambedkar. And I quote, "Take the depressed classes worker and compare his opportunities with a worker who does not belong to depressed classes. It is notorious that there are many avocations from which a depressed class worker is shut out by the reason of his untouchability. In those avocations where he has a chance to obtain work, he is employed in the lowest possible grade. There is no career for him, and often there is no promotion also for him. This is what happens to him when there is a slump. In the days of slump, he is the first one to be fired, and in the period of boom, he is the last one to be hired. That all the laborers are one and the same, and they form one class, is an ideal to be achieved, and it is the greatest error to assume that it is a fact. The real way to bring about unity is to remove the causes which make one worker antagonistic about another worker on the ground of race and religion. The real way to bring about unity is to tell the workers who make these social distinctions which result in unfair discrimination and wrong in principle and injurious to the solidarity of the workers, unquote. This stand of Dr. Ambedkar was not inconsistent with his wholehearted participation in the general strike against the Industrial Disputes Bill in 1938. This particular bill, which was brought to Bombay Legislative Assembly, it had aimed at restricting the right of the laborer to strike and making strike illegal. In a hard-hitting, elaborate speech in the Bombay Legislative Assembly, this was on September 15, 1938, and the subject was the Industrial Disputes Bill of 1938. Dr. Ambedkar said, and I quote, "This bill is intended to replace the Bombay Trade Disputes Conciliation Act of 1934. The Act of 1934 was intended to provide a machinery for conciliation. The principles of the Act of 1934 was voluntary reconciliation. Now, this bill introduces a change, namely that the conciliation shall be compulsory, and the question I submit, Dr. Ambedkar said, a question that arises for consideration of the House is whether any case has been made for altering the voluntary provision of the Act of 1934, giving it a compulsory character." He quoted the Chief Minister and the defense that Chief Minister had given, that there have been a number of strikes, but Dr. Ambedkar gave a very studious account of how situation has evolved to convince the House that in the interregnum, nothing has happened after 1934 which warrants such a drastic change from the voluntary nature of conciliation to compulsory nature of conciliation. Dr. Ambedkar said, and I quote him, "Turning to the other provisions of the bill, the provisions to which I wish to avert are the provisions relating to strikes, which undoubtedly are the most important, which I stoutly oppose." Now, the bill makes strikes under certain circumstances illegal. Then he added, in order to make this clause effective, the bill prescribes certain penalties for indulging in illegal strikes. Now, sir, he said, it has been said that these clauses are justifiable because there is no such thing as a right to strike. And the bill, therefore, in penalizing what the laborers call the right to strike, is certainly not contravening any rule of ethics or any rules of jurisprudence, Dr. Ambedkar said. Dr. Ambedkar argued, and I quote him, "My meaning of the word strike is nothing more than a breach of contract. And I submit that a strike is simply another name for the right to freedom. It is nothing else than the right to freedom of one's services on any terms that one wants to obtain. And once you concede the right to freedom, you necessarily concede the right to strike." The bill really, in my judgment, ought to be called, Dr. Ambedkar said, the Workers' Civil Liberties Suspension Act. That would be the proper title for it. Some have got the impression that after all, the suspension is only for 2 months until the conciliation proceedings are terminated. And after that, the workers would be at liberty to strike if they wish. Sir, Dr. Ambedkar said, I would like to say that this would be a very wrong impression. My contention, sir, is that provisions of this bill, when they are set in operation, will bring about a perpetual slavery, and the workers will never ever be able to strike. While concluding his argument, Dr. Ambedkar said, and I quote, "The bill as it is, I'm sure about it, should not be passed. It only handicaps labor. Labor may not know now what this bill does, but when the bill comes into operation and the laborer stands face to face with the bill, he will say that this bill is bad, bloody, and brutal bill. Sir, I cannot be a party to this." Unquote. Dr. Ambedkar joined forces with others, including the communist-led unions, and brought the strike against the Industrial Disputes Bill to a successful conclusion, thus creating history. During the general strike of 1938 against the Industrial Disputes Bill, Dr. Ambedkar organized a united front with the communists in the interest of the labor welfare. The main challenge then was to oppose tooth and nail the bill which he had described as bad, bloody, and bloodthirsty. Dr. Ambedkar did this while keeping his independent Labour Party intact from the machinations of the communists. There were other struggles that the Independent Labour Party organized on its own. Noteworthy in this regard was the settlement of some problems of the workers of the Bombay Municipal Corporation. The Independent Labour Party also took up the struggle for rights of workers in beedi industry. And this happened in the province which was then called Central Province and Berar. This way, by the end of 1938, Dr. Ambedkar had emerged as a labor leader. Well, friends, we can conclude this session here, but before I leave, let me remind you, if you like this audio video podcast series, please like it, share it, and subscribe to it. So long, we meet again real soon. Thank you. Namaskar.